I'm going to be talking about a big program that's, so my name's on the slide, but this isn't just me. This is a region-wide effort to sustain oak populations within the Chicago region. You may have noticed, you're in the Chicago region, you may have noticed that, and there's a lot of people here. So there's 9 million people in the Chicago metropolitan region. And there's also a lot of oaks, and we're trying to make those two coexist and play nicely with each other. And so I'm going to talk about a big regional program. First, to give you a little context, why are we doing this? Everyone in this room probably knows all this. Oaks are foundational or keystone species within oak ecosystems, which are support a lot of biodiversity, lots of different species, have a lot of really important ecosystem functions associated with them, and lots of charismatic mega and microfauna. In the Chicago region, so this is the pre-settlement, as we talk about it, the pre-European invasion, as some people would talk about it, landscape of the Chicago region. So the green is places that were forested, and the yellow is places that were prairie, and then there's a bunch of little things in there that I won't talk about. But so it was a mosaic landscape of forests and prairies that was maintained by a disturbance regime, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. Within this landscape, those places that were green, we have information on what kind of trees were there from the pre-settlement land surveys that the government did. So these are all the locations of trees that were recorded in those 1830s surveys. Those are all the ones that are oaks, and those are all the ones that weren't oaks. So there was a very oak-dominated landscape. You have a really hard time finding one of these forested areas in the pre-settlement landscape that wasn't oak-dominated. There's some here that had a lot of maples, but there's still oaks there, so that we still consider them to be oak ecosystems. So pretty much everything here that's a forest at the time of European settlement was an oak ecosystem. But we've lost a lot of that oak dominance from our landscape. So the black here is from modern tree census for the entire Chicago region, and the gray is from those pre-settlement surveys. And these are white oak, bur oak, and then elm, red oak. So it was about 60% basal area of oaks in those pre-settlement surveys. And we've gone down to about 20% relative basal area of oaks, and with a big increase in lots of the things that people plant in the urban forest or that come up spontaneously in the urban forest. So what happened? Well, there's the agriculture, grazing, there's office parks that go up near some of our ecosystems. So there's a lot of development that's happened with those 9 million people that now live here. We've also really changed the disturbance regime a lot. So this landscape that I was talking about was maintained by fire. So those weren't necessarily natural fires. They were set by the people that lived here before the European invasion. And the fires would move from west to east across the landscape. And so you'll notice that a lot of the places that had these forests were along the east sides of the rivers. So on the east sides of the fire breaks, the fires would burn across the landscape from west to east with the prevailing winds, and make this mosaic landscape. And we've basically taken that process out of the landscape, and that process doesn't really exist anymore. There's other things that we've taken out of the landscape. You'll hear more about this tonight with Joel Greenberg. Things like the passenger pigeon. This is a mound of dead passenger pigeons, which is I'm sure he'll show that in here. I'm sorry to. It's not. Oh.
Which also were grazing.
Okay, well, so it looks. Oh no, those are skulls. No, somebody gave me that. So just pretend it's a mound of passenger pigeons. I'm sure there were big mounds of them after they killed them all. There was hundreds of thousands of them that they would kill. But so the passenger pigeons would roost in the forest and create big openings with their feces, and killing the trees with their feces, and they would create these big openings big enough for oaks to regenerate in. We don't have that anymore, obviously. what we do have is an ecosystem which has undergone what some people refer to as a state change, where the ecosystem is now much denser canopy. It's not flammable anymore. If you go out and try and burn some of the forests around here, you can't do it. Kurt can attest to how difficult it can be to actually burn these forests now. Some people have called this mesafication or mapleization, where the maples, the more late successional fire-intolerant maples have come up and taken over the ecosystem and changed it such that it's no longer as flammable, and basically a really bad place for oaks to try and regenerate. There's also a lot more deer and a lot more of other seed predators in the landscape that reduce the ability for oaks to regenerate. So this has led to widespread oak regeneration failures all across the eastern U.S., including here in the Chicago region. And so what we have at a landscape scale is a population that is, so the black bars here are oaks. This is from our recent tree census. The gray is native non-oak species, a lot of it maples, and then non-native species in this striped bar. A lot of the oaks are these largest individuals, so that's where the oaks dominate. There's very few oaks relatively down here in the smaller size classes. Most of our oaks are around 150 years old. They germinated right at settlement. So the fires stopped happening, the oaks germinated, filled in, created forests, and those are the primary oaks that we have in the woods. Most of our oak species live, 200 years-ish. So we're coming up on a pretty important kind of time where a lot of those original oaks are going to starting to die off and senesce. And we don't really have another generation there waiting to take over when those oaks die. So lots of studies have indicated that there's not much oak regeneration. Here at the East Woods, we have some data. So there was about 90 oak seedlings and 3.5 oak saplings per acre. I should have put that in hectares because we have a lot of non-Americans in the audience. But what that really matters is that this represents 1.6 or 0.3% of the overall seedling and sapling pool in the forest. So basically nothing. I mean, there's tons of maples, there's no oaks in the woods. And all this has led to a lot of people saying, well, we need to put effort into conserving oaks, sustaining oak populations in the landscape. And we have, all these different plans say, oh, we should do something about oaks in the landscape. And people in the Chicago region said, well, let's come together and do something in our region, in this urban metropolitan region, to try and understand how we can maintain oaks within this, place where we have 9 million people, but we also have these remnant forests. So we got funding from the Forest Service to map where the oaks are that are left, the oak ecosystems that are left, and then develop a plan for how we might maintain oaks within this region. So the first thing that we did was trying to map where remnant oak ecosystems are within the Chicago region. This is the Chicago region of, some people call it the Chicago Wilderness. That's a big regional organization within northeastern Illinois. We're right about here. So we wanted to understand how the distribution of oak ecosystems has changed over time from that pre-settlement landscape through kind of the original aerial images that we can get to document where those ecosystems were to the modern era, and look at things like parcel size and who owns those oak ecosystems, and then try and think about how that can lead to opportunities to preserve and connect ecosystems in the modern landscape. So we started with, as I mentioned, these maps of the pre-settlement, pre-European landscape, the vegetation structure at that time. And this was developed by Marlon Bowles, who used to work here and is now retired and lives up in Alaska somewhere. And so at the time of European settlement, there was about 1 million acres of forested ecosystem within this Chicago region. And as I mentioned, that's pretty much all could be considered oak ecosystem. There was oaks everywhere within that. So we took that as our baseline and then said, okay, well, what was left in the 1930s, and then how much of what was left in the 1930s made it to 2010 by looking at aerial imagery. And so we had these original 1939 aerial images, kind of the first images that were taken at a national scale. And we had Matt Casale, who was a GIS tech that worked for me, went through and drew little circles around, or little polygons around all of the forests in that landscape. Forests that weren't just, very young trees that had just popped up. So this involved some like actually looking at the image and saying, okay, those are older trees that have probably been there for some time and are part of the remnant landscape. And then overlaid these green polygons on the modern landscape and said, well, where are there forests that made it through that transition to the highly urbanized landscape? And so those are what the yellow are there. So you can see there's some places that retained some forests, in this case because they were part of a naval base. And so we did that for the entire region and made this big map of where there were oak ecosystems, remnant oak ecosystems. So there's probably stuff that's come up since then, but these are the remnant ecosystems that we think that have really high ecological value. Around 17% of that original oak ecosystem area remains in the modern landscape. A lot of that was lost between the original landscape in 1939 with agricultural development and changes to the landscape during that period. But there's a lot of variability in how much there is left. The different colors here are the sizes of the parcels. So where you see these red and orange and purple, those are the larger parcels that we have left. I'll get to more about that in a second. But there was a lot of variation among the various counties within the Chicago region. So Cook County, which is the most urban, had about 18% remaining. Some of the counties in the northern part of the region had, even less, and that's because they started with more, so there was more to turn into developments. At a regional scale, there's very few small, large parcels left. So everything that's left is these little tiny fragments for the most part. In 1939, there was some pretty large parcels left, one even over 1,000 acres. But by 2010, we lost a good half of those large parcels from the landscape. They've been fragmented into smaller pieces. About 30% of what's left is in public ownership or some protected status. So we're sitting right here. You can see the Morton Arboretum sticks out. Hey, we're protected. Good work, Morton Arboretum. And it's highly variable across the region. So in Cook County, about 80% of what's left is protected. It's a super urban landscape with lots of emphasis on the Forest Preserve District. But some of these more rural counties have very little land in protected status. So we use this mapping to try and understand, opportunities for connecting what's left and creating corridors within the landscape. So the conservation biology part of this. So for example, the Des Plaines River corridor running through Cook County and Lake County could provide an opportunity for making a large corridor within the landscape. There's obviously challenges with creating corridors in highly urbanized systems, though. We'd have to cross some pretty major superhighways to get through that. It also points to areas within those that might help create those corridors that would have really high conservation value, and also places that we might want to target for acquisition or conservation in the future. It also gives us an idea of some places that might have some remnant value, even though they're not protected land now or not even natural areas now. So for example, the Morton Arboretum's west side here, which you may see, which is where we're sitting, we're up here somewhere. Yeah, we're right there. So this is the lime green was the original oak ecosystem here. The Morton Arboretum has conserved a pretty good chunk of it, but the rest of it got turned into this housing development up here. But you'll notice the part that was the oak ecosystem is a lot different looking canopy-wise than the part that wasn't. And there's probably some remnant oaks up there that have some value in terms of ecosystem services. They probably provide some wildlife habitat or maybe an ecological trap for all the birds to get eaten by cats. But it's important to know where those are in the landscape because it might create some corridors or buffers that we might be able to use from a conservation biology perspective. So this all is going into this idea of creating a recovery plan for the region as a whole. We identified 6 focal areas. I'm just going to run through this really quick because I know we're all hungry. But we're interested in looking at natural areas, municipal forests and park districts, reforestation and reclamation, so planting new oak forests. How would we best do that on really degraded sites or maybe in some really nice sites that we're able to acquire? How do we manage for oaks in private lands, using landscaping, conservation easements, that sort of thing? Getting the nursery industry to be on our side and work with us on getting more oaks into the landscape. And then a lot of outreach and education. Somebody talked about Oaktober yesterday, so I guess it's Oaktober. So that's why we're having the meeting now, right? One of the big things that we're doing is working on ecosystem restoration and trying to adapt what we know about oak management. So managing for oaks in forests. We know a lot about that, right? So we've been doing silviculture on oaks for hundreds of years here. But we don't do a lot of that in urban natural areas, and I'll talk about why it's important to think about it in that context. Most of what we do in urban natural areas right now doesn't really do much good for trying to promote oaks in the landscape. So we do these fires. This is one of Kurt's fires. It looks like it's burning, but that's not changing the structure of the ecosystem. It's promoting biodiversity in the ground layer, obviously, and changing the structure of the litter layer, but it's not affecting those large trees or making the ecosystem more open. So as we all probably know, most of the oaks that we're dealing with at least, require pretty high sunlight to grow well. And this is what a lot of our forests around here look like, dense maple canopy. So from a forestry perspective, I come from a forestry background. Well, we just go in and clear cut or do a shelter wood or something to promote those oaks. So we cut all the trees down. But if you did this in an urban natural area, they'd probably try and find whatever tree you had left and then string you up from it. So this is not something we can just go out and do in the east side of the Morton Arboretum here. If we did this in the East Woods, everyone would be really upset. So we have to try and adapt what we know about silviculture for oaks to urban natural areas and do things a little bit more nuanced than maybe you would have to in a forestry setting. So things like multi-cohort management and phased treatments. So doing treatments, multiple treatments. We have a lot of resources. One thing we do have in urban natural areas is the resources to go back in every few years and do treatments. So we have a big project going up in Lake County, which is the northern part of the Chicago region, where we're trying out some techniques for how to manage for oaks in urban natural areas. So trying to create heterogeneity and create places that oaks could actually regenerate within the system. And it's a large-scale replicated experiment in 4 of the best sort of remnant natural oak forests in the region. And replicated across sites and then a bunch of replications of different treatments within the sites. And the treatments, I'll just say this quickly. So the treatments are trying to vary the spatial distribution of canopy removal and the timing of removal and the intensity of removal to try and find a sweet spot where we can actually manage for oaks and not have people get really upset with us. And we have a lot of research going into understanding how these treatments are working. So how is it working in terms of oak regeneration and the physiology of the oaks, planted oak seedlings? And then how does it affect the ecosystem in terms of the heterogeneity and resource conditions and structure? And then all of the other wildlife and invertebrates and microbial communities that are associated with them. And if anybody wants to go to grad school, I'm going to need some grad students to work on this. So let me know. So this is what we got so far. We're going from this dark maple woodlands to maple forest to a nice open oak woodland, and maybe the oaks will like that, right? Maybe they'll grow fast. We'll see. We'll actually be up next week. Maybe we'll see if any of them survived. And with that, as I said, this is a big collaborative regional project, so I could put everybody. There's 9 million people, so most of them would be up here. But these are the main people that and organizations that I probably need to thank.